Greetings. This is going to be a lecture on rhetorical devices and how we use rhetorical devices or misuse rhetorical devices to be persuasive when arguing for a particular position or point of view. So let me share my screen. All right, rhetorical devices then. Oops. So rhetoric is the art of persuasive writing and speaking. And at least since the days of the sophists and Aristotle, rhetoric has been considered an essential part of Western education, along with and distinct from logic. One uses rhetoric to hold the attention of one's audience and to win them to one's point of view. Logic is used to demonstrate that the thesis is supported by reasons. But presenting a cogent reasons for one's position and holding one's audience attention in an appealing way are separate enterprises. And both are going to be required if you're going to be an effective speaker. Not only do you need to present powerful logical arguments, but you need to present them in a way that your audience is going to listen to and pay attention to and find appealing. Keep in mind that in the real world, people are often persuaded by poor logic and sometimes remain unmoved by good logic. So the logic alone isn't as compelling if it is detached from the way it's presented, right? You've heard that the media is the message. Well, I'm not quite sure I believe that, but certainly the media shapes the message. This is very good reason to promote critical thinking, that is, to help people improve one's grasp of logic so that you're not taken in by poor logic and you are moved by good logic, but also to help them distinguish logical proofs from rhetorical persuasions. And so that's one of the aims of this lecture and this course. So in this module, we're going to introduce the concept of rhetorical force, explain several common rhetorical devices, none of which have logical force or probative weight. Probative just means a tendency to prove. We're going to examine 4 techniques of demagoguery, or the use of inflammatory rhetoric to win the acceptance for false or misleading ideas. This often involves an appeal to fears or prejudices of the audience. So that's where we'll finish up with. So let's consider what is meant by rhetorical force. Words and expressions have a literal or dictionary meaning, but they can also have what is known as an emotive meaning or rhetorical force. So they can have a connotation, which is this sort of suggestive force. And again, it's sort of a psychological association. They have the power to express and elicit various psychological and emotional responses in the minds of the audience. For example, I might refer to the same person as an elderly gentleman or an old codger. Now notice, both of these descriptions refer to a senior man, right, an older individual, but they evoke significantly different emotions. I might say, she took the paper from me, or I might say she snatched the paper out of my hand. Well, those are descriptions of pretty much the same event, but they carry with them different psychological connotations and, again, rhetorical descriptions. We might say that the rollout of the new website had problems, or we might say it presented us with opportunities for improvement. Right? So I worked for a while in administration, and it's very common that you don't refer to problems, you refer to opportunities and challenges, right? But not problems. In each case, these two expressions have more or less the same literal meaning, but different rhetorical effects. George Orwell once said that political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and to give the appearance of solidity to pure wind. Now, there's nothing wrong with someone trying to make his or her case as persuasive as possible. Indeed, a solid logical argument will fail to persuade if the audience is so bored they're not paying any attention. Good writers use well-chosen, rhetorically effective words and phrases. And so I'm not trying to diss on rhetoric or rhetorical devices in general, But I am pointing out that rhetorical devices are different than logical argument. And we have to be on guard that we don't mistake a well-crafted bit of rhetoric for a logically argued piece of writing. Nevertheless, as critical thinkers, we must be able to distinguish argument, if any, contained in the passage from the rhetoric. We must distinguish between the logical force of a set of remarks and its psychological force. The first group of rhetorical devices are usually single words or short phrases designed to give a statement a positive or negative slant. For this reason, they are sometimes referred to as slanters. So we're going to look at a set of slanters. The first kind of slanter we're looking at is a euphemism. Euphemisms seek to mute the disagreeable aspects of something or to emphasize the agreeable aspects. Euphemism is coming from the Greek eu, which is a prefix that often means happy or blessed or pleasant, right? And phenem, which is a bit of speech. So a euphemism is a happy or a pleasant little bit of speech. And so the idea, and notice we see in words like euphoria or, well, euphemism, or euthanasia would be a happy death. But anyway, it would be a word that we use to avoid saying something which might be a little harsher or thought to be disagreeable. So I'll read my bullet. The euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something which is unpleasant or embarrassing. It is a neutral or positive expression used in the place of one that carries with it negative associations. When I was young, for instance, it was considered rude or in poor taste to describe a family member as pregnant. One instead would say, she's in the family way. It was a euphemism, right? Often, a detainee is simply a prisoner, but it seems more benign to refer to that individual as a detainee, right? Collateral damage seems to be a way of sanitizing the idea of civilian casualties. Again, it's a euphemism. Euphemisms obviously can be used to obfuscate or whitewash wrongdoing, but they can have positive uses as well. For instance, it might be insensitive to tell your friends, "Oh, I'm sorry that you killed your dog." Instead, you might say, "Oh, I'm sorry that you had to put your dog to sleep." Right? Again, it's a euphemism for euthanizing your pet. She died can be rendered something more softer by saying she passed on, or she has joined the choir invisible. I kind of like that one myself. Euphemisms again seek to mute the disagreeable aspects, as already noted. But dysphemisms, coming from dysphenim, seek to emphasize the disagreeable aspects of something. A dysphemism is used to produce a negative effect on someone's attitude about something, or to tone down the positive associations it may have. It sounds worse to be obscenely rich than to say he's very wealthy. Right? Eating animal flesh sounds worse than eating meat. Right? A tax imposed on an inheritance is sometimes called a death tax, which leaves a bad taste in one's mouth because it seems to suggest that the deceased, rather than the inheritors, is somehow being penalized. Dismissing a legislative proposal as a scheme also qualifies as a dysphemism, right? So, oh yes, the Democrats' crazy tax scheme. Well, again, it's a dysphemism, right? It's a negative way of referring to a plan. You naturally expect to find a generous sprinkling of dysphemisms when a speaker or a writer is trying to get us to dislike someone or to something. During political campaigns, they crop up everywhere. Of course, what counts as a euphemism or a dysphemism to some extent is in the eye of the beholder. One person's junkyard is another person's automotive recycling business, and one person's sanitary landfill is another person's garbage dump. Finally, there is this: some facts are just plain repellent. And for that reason, even neutral reports of them sound appalling. To say Lizzie Borden killed her father with an axe is not a dysphemism. It's simply reporting a horrible fact about Lizzie Borden. A third kind of rhetorical device would be Weaslers, right? And Weaslers seek to protect a claim by weakening it. In other words, by weakening the claim, you make it less susceptible to challenge. So again, Weaslers are rhetorical devices that help protect a claim from objective criticism by watering it down, weakening it to such a degree that it is difficult to challenge. For instance, if I were to say that you could save up to 50% if you buy the product on sale today, what have I really told you? Did I really guarantee that you would save 50%? Or that you would save anything at all, for that matter? No, right? If I said you could save up to 50%, that's not really a guarantee of anything, is it? In fact, all I've committed myself to say is you can save no more than 50%. But you could save considerably less or perhaps nothing at all. In this case, up to is a phrase that's acting as a rhetorical Weasler on the claim you can save 50%. So if I had simply said you could save 50%, that would have been a bold claim, and you could challenge that if you save less. If I say you could save up to 50%, on what basis could you challenge that claim? Well, it seems I've weakened it so that there really isn't much of a basis you have to challenge it. That's the nature of a Weasler. Likewise, if I told you that once you complete my online reading program, you will virtually read 3 to 4 to even 10 times faster than you do now. That might initially sound quite impressive, but look carefully at what I've said. We must step back and ask ourselves, what is virtual reading? Here, the word virtual is acting as a Weasler on the claim you will read faster. If I had simply said you will read 3 times faster than you read now once you complete my program, well, you can challenge that if you complete my program and you read less than 3 times faster. But if I said you will virtually read 3 times faster, on one basis can you challenge that claim? Again, that's the nature of a Weasler. They modify the claim in such a way that it makes it inoculated from challenge. Remember, a claim does not have to be false in order to be misleading. Imagine I said, scientists remain unconvinced that human activity is the cause for global climate change. Be careful here. I've left off the quantifier. Notice, am I saying all scientists remain unconvinced? Most scientists remain unconvinced? Many? Some? Few? 2? Well, I haven't. I haven't given you a quantifier rather. I haven't given you a quantifier. The missing quantifier, and here it's the absence, is what's acting as a Weasler. You don't know, since I didn't say, and you cannot accuse me of saying something false if at least 2 scientists remain unconvinced. Further, you are not being a critical thinker if, after I offered that to you, you believe that all or most remain unconvinced merely by being told what I have said is true. Because notice, all I'm really committed to in that claim is at least 2. Leaving out the quantifier is often employed as a Weasler. So you want to be on guard against that. Doctors prefer, scientists agree, experts claim. All of that left off the quantifiers. Likewise, be on guard against words such as perhaps, possibly, or maybe. These 2 can be used to plant suggestions without actually making a claim. If I were to say, perhaps he's not qualified for that position, have I made a claim here? What if I remove the word perhaps? Well, if I remove the word perhaps, I am making a bold claim. He is not qualified for that position. So the function of the word perhaps in that sentence is to act as a Weasler. Again, it inoculates my claim from challenge and plants a suggestion. Now, to be sure, not every use of these words constitutes a Weasler. In one context, it may be a Weasler, and in another context, not a Weasler. Appropriate use of Weaseling words are when the claim needs to be qualified and the person is just being upfront about it. The trouble comes when the Weasler is being used to create an innuendo of a claim without actually making one, as in the previous example. Perhaps he's not qualified for that position. Rhetorical devices, downplayers. The last of these first four is a downplayer, which seeks to tone down the importance of something, or perhaps the authority or expertise of someone. These are rhetorical devices used to downplay the significance of something or of a person's opinion. Were I to point out that Sam Harris, the popular public speaker on philosophical matters and ethics, only has a baccalaureate degree in philosophy, and I use this fact to downplay the significance of his philosophical claims, this is a rhetorical device, a downplayer. While it is true, it would appear that the only reason I bring it to your attention is to downplay. I've not actually addressed directly what may be wrong with his philosophical positions or addressed his actual views at all. So I seem to be bringing up the fact that he's expressing opinion on philosophical matters, but his credential in philosophy only amounts to a baccalaureate degree. Well, again, only a baccalaureate degree is a sort of downplayer. Air quotes can be used to the same effect. So for I to say she got her degree from a correspondence course, school rather, that would be a downplayer. I'm trying to diminish the importance or the significance of her degree. Likewise, if I said he was a doctor in his former country, well, again, that seems to be a downplayer of his previous position. One might also conjoin two actually unrelated claims in a hope that the attention to one will divert the significance of attention paid to the other. Consider this. If I said, yes, he won the election, but it was very close and he won only by a little over 1,000 votes. On the other hand, what if I made almost exactly the same claim? And I said, while we anticipated that the election would be very close, nevertheless, he won by over 1,000 votes. Well, in the first case, I seem to be downplaying the win. And the downplayer is affected by saying a little over 1,000 votes. In the other case, I seem to be downplaying the narrow margin of victory by emphasizing that we thought it was going to be close, and yet by over 1,000 votes, he won the election. Right? The statement is the same in both cases. He won the election by a little over 1,000 votes. Well, one is acting as a downplayer on the other, depending on how it's framed. And again, that's the nature of a downplayer. Or consider, the leak at the plant was terrible, but the plant provides good, high-paying jobs to thousands of people in the community. Conversely, I might say, although the plant provides good jobs to thousands of people in the community, the leak was terrible. So which is acting as a downplayer on the other depends on how it's been framed, what's put first, and what the point of contrast was. So again, here I'm conjoining two unrelated claims in a hope that attention to one will divert the significance and attention paid to the other. The final of the, actually it's five. The final of the first five we're looking at is stereotypes. And again, these are cultural beliefs about which, about a social group, and it attributes to them which is either simplified or exaggerated. A stereotype, again, is a cultural belief about a social group's attributes, which is usually simplified or exaggerated rather. These can be positive or negative. Americans are sometimes stereotyped as being friendly and generous, positive, or as boorish and insensitive, negative. But of course, to assume that just because one is an American, one has certain characteristics is unwarranted. Likewise, were I to say she's a typical American, and you came to some conclusion based on that remark, I would have convinced you of a point without ever proving it. Again, you are unjustified to make assumptions about some characteristics she possesses merely by the fact that I've told you she's a typical American. Well, perhaps that she's, American citizen or a resident of the United States or something like that. But in terms of qualitative characteristics, it really tells you nothing. I would have employed some stereotype, and perhaps one you are guilty of as well, to persuade you without evidence. So that's the nature of stereotypes. Stereotypes have their sources in literature and entertainment, music, etc. Some stereotypes carry much rhetorical force, but they have no evidentiary or probative force. Rhetoric that contains them may be persuasive psychologically, but it is neither strengthened nor weakened logically. So you want to be on guard against that. Innuendo, using the power of suggestion to disparage someone or something, or to suggest rather than to claim. So we anticipated innuendo in one of the earlier rhetorical devices, one of the first 5. We've already looked at it a bit. Innuendo sometimes uses the power of suggestion to disparage, that is, to say something bad about someone without coming out and claiming it. Alternatively, one can use innuendo to apply something positive about a person or something, again, without explicitly claiming it or offering support. However, unlike euphemisms or dysphemisms, these need not be overtly positive or negative. Indeed, they might be completely neutral on the face of it. Consider this. Have you noticed many unaccompanied young boys coming to your next door neighbors recently? There seems to be an innuendo. I'm suggesting something, perhaps something nefarious. Here I have not made a claim about your next door neighbor. Rather, I've simply asked you a question. But in asking you the question, I am making a subtle implication, again, an innuendo. For instance, if you ask me, is Ralph telling the truth? And I respond, yes, this time. Well, that seems to be suggesting that Ralph is given to not telling the truth, and that this is somehow an unusual instance where he's in fact telling the truth. Or if I said, she's just his aerobics instructor, at least that's what he tells his wife. What have I claimed? Well, I haven't claimed anything at all, but I certainly have implied something. Or again, I've engaged in innuendo. Innuendo, again, is using the power of suggestion to disparage someone or something. Now, the next would be loaded questions. These are questions that depend on unwarranted assumptions. The classic example of a loaded question is, have you stopped beating your wife? Right? Notice that question seems to require a yes or no answer. Right? But no matter how you answer that, yes or no, the implication is that you have previously been beating your wife. That's how this works. Every question rests on assumptions. Even an innocent question like, what time is it, depends on the assumption that the hearer speaks English and probably has a means of finding out what time it is and understands the idea of telling time, etc. A loaded question, however, rests on one or more unwarranted, unjustified assumptions. Again, the world's oldest example, well, maybe not the oldest example, most classic example, is, have you stopped beating your wife? But it seems to rest on the assumption that the person asked has been beating his wife in the past. It presumes that a previous question has been asked and answered in the affirmative. Specifically, have you ever beaten your wife? Yes. Well then, have you stopped beating your wife? But of course, that question was never asked, nor was it answered. If there is no reason to think that this assumption is true, then the question is a loaded question. Why does the president hate poor people? Implies, without quite asserting, that the president hates poor people. Can this candidate save his floundering campaign? Again, the question itself implies that this campaign is in a deep trouble, and the candidate might be unable to turn things around. Loaded questions thus can count as a form of innuendo, as they imply something negative about someone without, or something for that matter, without actually claiming it. However, they can also be used to carry a positive message as well, as in the example, how did Melanie acquire such a beautiful voice? Ridicule and sarcasm is another rhetorical device widely used to put something in a bad light. Humor and a bit of his exaggeration are part of our everyday speech, but they can also be used in ways to sway opinion if the listener is not being careful. Also known as a horse laugh, this device includes ridicule or vicious humor of all kinds. Ridicule is a powerful rhetorical tool. Most of us hate to be laughed at or to be ridiculed. So it is important to remember that someone who simply gets a laugh at the expense of another person's position has not actually raised any objections to that position. One may simply laugh outright at a claim, send aid to Egypt, ha, 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 or tell an unrelated joke, use sarcastic language, or simply laugh at the person who is trying to make the point. So the next time you watch a debate, remember that the person who has the funniest lines and who gets the most laughs may be the person who seems to win the debate, but critical thinkers should be able to see the difference between argumentation on the one hand and entertainment on the other. Notice we're not saying there's anything wrong with entertainment, nor with making a valid point in a humorous way. I think that's very effective. Again, rhetorical devices can be valuable. We're merely pointing out that if all it is a ridicule and sarcasm, then we want to be on guard and not be persuaded by that. Then the final one we're going to be looking at is hyperbole. Hyperbole, sometimes also pronounced hyperbole, but I grew up calling it hyperbole, and I still do, is overdone exaggeration. Hyperbole is an extravagant overstatement or an exaggeration. And this is a perfectly fine figure of speech, and we do these sort of things. And we might say, he was the greatest orator of all time, or something like that. And in certain contexts, it's just understood that I'm exaggerating in a way to either praise or to ridicule someone. But it can also have a rhetorical effect, right? So again, something like Democrats want everyone to be on welfare, of course, is hyperbole. Or to say no one in the Tea Party likes African Americans is likewise hyperbole. Now, again, I think most people would read those remarks and know that, literally speaking, they're false and that they're exaggerations and, gross exaggerations, perhaps. The rhetorical effect is that they do suggest that some Democrats really do want, maybe not all, but some Democrats want everybody on welfare, or many people in the Tea Party don't like African Americans, right? So if I exaggerate and you don't believe the exaggeration, but you do follow me that, well, there must be something up with those Tea Party people or those Democrats, well, then the hyperbole has had its rhetorical effect. Again, not that you believe it outright, but that you formed an opinion based on nothing other than an exaggeration. Again, describing your parents as fascists because they don't want you to major in art also counts as hyperbole. People exaggerate, we all exaggerate, not only to express how strongly we feel about something, but sometimes to persuade our listeners of a lesser claim. So, for example, to persuade you, if I said that this was the most corrupt president in history, or vice president in history of the country, you might recognize that as likely a hyperbole. You might nevertheless believe that there must be something corrupt about him for me to make such an extravagant claim. So again, that's the danger of hyperbole. Not that you believe my claim outright, but that you think there must be something there, or they wouldn't make such an extravagant claim. If you do, my hyperbole has been rhetorically effective. Consider something like this: the salmon is the best you will ever eat. Well, if on the basis of that, you want to say, well, I don't necessarily believe that's true, but it must be pretty good. Well, I've convinced you with this exaggeration. Or Clara thinks of nobody but herself. You think, well, maybe that may not be true, but she's probably a little self-centered if he's saying that about it. Or if I said no one will vote for Jackson, well, you don't necessarily believe that no one will, but you might believe that he has a poor chance of winning the the election, right? Well, to believe that based on this hyperbole would again be to use the hyperbole to rhetorical effect. Then the last thing I want to talk about is extreme rhetoric or demagoguery, right? And there are 4 techniques often employed by demagogues: othering, demonization, fostering xenophobia, fear, and hate mongering. These are used by demagogues to manipulate the opinion of the audience. We must be on guard when we feel ourselves enthralled by a speaker, with our blood pumping and our pulses rising. In particular, when we're being turned against some person or some group. The critical thinker should step back and analyze what's being said and dial down the outrage. So that's what these things have in common. They're trying to stir up emotion and stir up outrage by appealing to things which are, in fact, irrelevant or exaggerations. Othering, for instance, is when you're emphasizing they are not us, and indeed they are somehow inferior or perhaps threatening to us. So when the speaker is trying to identify, we, you and I, we're together, but we're not those people who we're against. We're superior to them. They are inferior to us. We are threatened by them. Well, that's othering, right? And I'm making a clear divide between this group I'm disparaging or perhaps these ideas I'm disparaging. Demonization is when I'm talking about the they, but I'm not claiming they're just wrong. I'm saying they're evil. They are intentionally opposing the forces of good, right? That's the notion of it, demonizing them. It's one thing to think, oh, I don't agree with your policy. I think you're mistaken. Pardon me. I think you're mistaken. But to say, but that's not the nature of demonization. Demonization is saying that you know what you're saying is wrong. You know what you're saying is evil, and yet you're supporting it anyway. That's what I'm demonizing you. Or when I'm speaking to you and demonizing someone else by ascribing to them these sort of bad intentions and these evil motives. Fostering xenophobia is when it's similar to othering, but it's when I'm emphasizing the strangeness, the otherness, but the otherness in the sense of they do things very differently, weirdly. They have odd practices or odd institutions, or maybe I'm pointing out how differently they dress, or how differently they worship, or how differently they speak, or how differently they arrange their family arrangements or units, etc. But I'm emphasizing the differentness between us and them, right? The strangeness, as opposed to the familiarity of the us. So it's similar to othering, but again, the difference is not just the us against them, but the strangeness of the other. And then finally, fear mongering and playing into hate. This is where you are playing into pre-existing animosities, resentments, and unresolved past conflicts. And so, when the other group is a group with whom we've had disagreements in the past, or by whom we've been wronged, or about whom we already have existing animosities or resentments, and the demagogue is going to play into those, fan those flames, and get us all again enraged again. So note that these are often directed at individuals or groups of individuals rather than at ideas or theories. One might employ these rhetorical devices of demagoguery, pardon me, in an attempt, to discredit the ideas of the individual who support these ideas or are known to hold those ideas. So by disparaging the group or the individual, I think I've somehow discredited the idea. Of course, I haven't. I haven't spoken about the ideas. Well, you want to be on guard against that, right? This is a way demagogues work. They think that they can defeat their opponent's position by building up bad feelings or worries or fears or anger towards their opponent. But of course, that leaves the opponent's ideas untouched and unexamined. And this is something the critical thinker would be on guard against. Final word. A student recently contacted me asking me for some explicit examples of extreme demagoguery. Initially, I did not think that was going to be difficult to do. However, this was more challenging than I anticipated. I started researching it, and I discovered that there isn't widespread agreement on precisely what demagoguery is, or perhaps more to the point, who demagogues are. It is generally agreed that demagoguery has something to do with individuals who are very effective at using speech to persuade large audiences, and that their persuasive powers seem to be based more on rhetorical appeal rather than logic or well-reasoned arguments. So that is a sort of neutral description of demagoguery, and most people agree that those are features of demagoguery. But which individuals from history one can point to as examples of demagogues, or examples of demagoguery itself, or extreme rhetoric of demagoguery, is more controversial. Naturally, conservatives accuse effective speakers from the liberal side of the aisle of being demagogues. And not just as naturally, liberals often accuse conservatives of being effectively moving audiences rhetorically, being demagogues rather than giving cogent arguments for their positions. So it's natural to see in the political realms individuals describing their opponents as demagogues, whereas not necessarily describing members of their own side as demagogues. Some have suggested that another element of a true demagogue is that they use their persuasive language and powers not in pursuit of something they genuinely believe to be true, but rather for their own personal benefit. However, others have suggested that the most dangerous demagogues are ones who are fully committed to the views they are espousing. So there isn't uniform agreement that there has to be this disingenuous motivation behind a demagogue. No, some demagogues are effective precisely because they are fully committed to the cause. So I realized that doesn't really answer my student's question, but I did enjoy researching it. In the end, I suppose that the word demagogue is an inherently ambiguous word. It has useful context, but it defies explicit definition. Again, a set of necessary and jointly sufficient conditions. Further, labeling someone a demagogue is more an act of rhetorical name-calling, a dysphemism, and less than enlightening. Better than to point out the specific rhetorical devices that they are employing, whether that's othering, demonizing, etc., rather than just calling them a demagogue, because that would be a clearer and less and more enlightening and more useful way of critically engaging their rhetorical overreaching. So I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. It does. I hope this has been helpful to you. Naturally, if you have questions on the notes or anything I've said here in the PowerPoints, please get in touch with me. And I wish you a good, pleasant rest of your day.